Firm Foundations, Creation to Christ. Welcome back to our study. We are now in lesson 18, but like always, we're going to go over just a few review questions from our previous study. First of all, by what authority did God command Abraham to, to offer his son as a sacrifice? Remember in our last lesson, we talked about God calling Abraham to take his only son, the son that was going to be Abraham's offspring to produce that great nation that God had promised, according to Abraham. And God called him to sacrifice that son. So, by what authority did God do that? Why was he? What was going on there? Well, God had given life to Isaac, and so it's very simple. He rightfully belonged to God, just like all of us do. We think our life is our own, but we deceive ourselves. Our lives belong to God. He has authority to tell us what to do. He does. He's our life giver, our creator. Second, number two, did Abraham think God had changed his mind about Isaac? About Isaac becoming the father of a great nation and the ancestor of this coming deliverer? What do you think? Did Abraham think that God changed his mind? That he wasn't going to fulfill his promise? Sometimes that's our natural conclusion, but no. He believed God would keep his promises and thought God would raise Isaac back to life after being sacrificed, because God is the life giver. He's a life giver. He's the only one who has the right to take human life. It belongs to him. But Abraham believed that God would raise him back from the dead. Who was the only one who could save Isaac? I mean, Isaac was bound. He was on the altar. And Abraham, a believer in God, and God had already given the command. There was only one person who could have saved him. God called for the sacrifice. He was the only one who could have stopped it, and that's exactly what he did. How can any of us save ourselves from everlasting punishment, which we all deserve because of our sins? Because this moment in history with Abraham and Isaac and him being sacrificed, which is what death is what we deserve for our sin. Isaac was just the same. He deserved death from us. That's what he deserved. And Isaac couldn't save himself when he was bound and on the altar. And that's a picture of what sin does for us. Can any of us save ourselves from that? Nope, nobody can. We're absolutely helpless to do anything to save ourselves because the punishment for our wrongdoing is death, eternal separation from God. Why was the ram caught in the bushes by its thorn? Remember when Isaac was on the altar, and the angel said, "Stop! Don't kill this! Don't kill your son." And he let him go. And it was a test of his faith. He was going to sacrifice him. But then, when he was on the altar, there was a ram caught by the bushes for the sacrifice that God provided for Abraham. And it was caught by its horns. And there was a specific reason. We see that more details of that farther on in the Bible, but it was so it wouldn't be injured. Because God is perfect. The only sacrifice that is acceptable to him is the one that is perfect, without injury, without blemish. And the ram, if it was caught by any other part of its body, it could have been injured, and it wouldn't have been an acceptable sacrifice. It wouldn't have been perfect the way God had created it anymore. And that's what God requires, a complete, perfect sacrifice. And number 6, why did Abraham name the place where he was going to sacrifice Isaac? The Lord will provide. In the original language, that's Yahweh Jireh or Jehovah Jireh. You hear that term, and it means the Lord will provide. And why did he name that? Remember what happened? Because God provided a substitute to die in Isaac's place. And because Abraham believed God would provide this coming deliverer to rescue mankind from Satan's power and everlasting punishment. Remember that promise back in Genesis chapter 3? That God promised the seed of the woman, somebody would come in a future generation that would give Satan, the serpent, a mortal blow to his head and deliver people from his influence and his power. But at this moment in history, God provided a substitute for a person so the person could live and the animal died. This principle of substitute, we're going to see this throughout Scripture, specifically in the sacrifice, because we deserve to die, and if someone doesn't die in our place, we have to die and be separated from God. Because sin is a serious deal, and God hates it. He hates sin. He hates evil. But he loves us, and he offers us a way of escape. And he provided that for Isaac. This lesson, number 18. God chose Jacob to be the ancestor of this coming deliverer. That's the title of this lesson. Let's begin to this. And we're going to see circumstances throughout our study that seem impossible to overcome. But God's purpose remains firm and unchangeable. When God decides to do something, nothing can stop him. Nothing can deter him. Life's events, strong beings, people, spirits, nothing can stop him. And even though something happens to us that looks like, oh, it's impossible, it's never going to happen now, God does something to complete his plan. And in every generation, there are people who believe his promises, and there are those who don't. Those who cherish his word, who want to grow in the knowledge of what he's communicating to us, and those people receive the benefits and blessings of trusting him. And those who treat God's word as unimportant, their lives tend to be empty and fruitless, and at the end they'll be separated eternally from God. There's no other place to exist outside of God's presence besides the place that he created for the devil and his angels in the lake of fire for eternity. And there's options that God's giving us, calling us to believe him. So God's promises to Abraham, remember those in Genesis chapter 12 and 15 and 17, those promises were passed down to his son Isaac, the one that he was going to sacrifice, where his faith was tested, and God provided the sacrifice in his place. Well, Abraham's son Isaac, he married a young woman named Rebekah, and in Genesis 25:19 and 20, it says, and these are generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean. And so this Rebekah was from Haran, up north. Remember Haran? And look at our map. Haran was a place where Abraham stopped on his journey from Ur to Canaan. And so this Rebekah was from that place. And Isaac got his wife from that place. Maybe they had relatives there or friends that they developed in the process while they were living there. We don't know all those details, but that's where Rebekah was from. And then Abraham died. When Abraham died, Isaac inherited these promises from God that God had given to his father. Remember the promises? His descendants would inherit all the land of Canaan, all the land that God showed him when he arrived, and also that God would make him a great nation, and that that through Abraham, all the nations of the earth were going to be blessed, be benefited, all families of the earth. Those are the promises. And then Isaac and Rebekah, they're married. They had two sons, Esau and Jacob. These guys were twins born at the same time, and apparently they weren't identical twins. Isaac and Rebekah, up into their old age, they were without children. Rebekah was barren. She couldn't have kids. Genesis 25:21 to 23, it says, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And that was an embarrassment in that society. It was a thing of shame, and it was something that a man and woman desired to have children, to carry on their family line, and probably their trade and their family. They wanted to build a family, have it be carried on, not just end with them. And the Lord granted Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The child struggled together within her. She was going to have twins. And she said, um, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? It's supposedly a blessing from the Lord. So she went to the Lord to inquire. These two kids inside of her struggling, these twins. And the Lord said to her, two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. Now that just didn't happen. The older serve the younger. That wasn't culturally appropriate. God was doing something here, and he was informing Rebecca beforehand. Two nations in you, and the younger is going to rule over the older one. The older, she's going to serve the younger. God's letting her know what's going on. God knew all these details before they were born. God can know that because nothing is hidden from him. He sees the future. He knows every detail. Psalm 139 is an excellent psalm to express that very idea. It says in verse 13 to 16, for you were formed in my inward parts. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. This David is writing this psalm and just expressing the knowledge that we have in us, that God made us. Our life didn't come from nothing. 139:15, my frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, every one of the day of this author's days were written in God's book. God knew everyone before it happened. The days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. God knew all the details before they happened. Like this author's expressing, King David. And he knows every detail of our lives before it happens. He's not restricted by time. He's all-knowing. Genesis, that's how God could inform Rebecca of the sons that were going to be born. Genesis 25:24 to 26 says, when her days were to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. I believe the name Esau means red. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. This man, 60 years old, having kids. I can't even imagine. But that's how old he was. And God did a miracle to have this older couple have kids. And they had twins, Esau and Jacob. Esau the oldest, Jacob the youngest. But Jacob grabbing his brother's heel, a symbol of what was going to happen in their lives, coming right after his older brother. And so we come in our timeline right around 1750 before Christ. Isaac has Esau and Jacob. Esau and Jacob were very different from one another. We already read a little bit about that. But as they grew up, they were different. In Genesis 25:27, it says, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. They were different from each other, different in character, different in talents. And so when Esau was born, he was the firstborn, and the firstborn in that culture has the right to a double portion of the father's inheritance. And when his father died, he would automatically become the head of their family group. He would also be the guardian of God's promises. The promises that had been passed down from Abraham to Isaac, well, they would pass down to Esau. And as time went on, Esau's family would eventually grow through the line, and that's where this coming deliverer would be born. And so that's what his right was naturally. But we see that the two grow up, and we see Esau's true character revealed in a simple incident. And this happens to us too. It can be a simple incident that reveals our character. In Genesis 25:29 through 34, it says, um, one, once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I'm exhausted." Um, Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright and now." Imagine that. So hungry, and Jacob comes up with this idea: "Sell me your birthright. I want to be the one who inherits what's going to be given of our father." And Esau said, "I'm about to die. What use is a birthright to me?" I mean, that's how lightly he treated this important birthright. Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Um, Remember what we talked about? His birthright was he was going to inherit a double portion from his father and become the leader of their family group, and the promises he was going to inherit the promises of God. And through him, this coming deliverer was going to come, and he sold it all. Sold it all in just a moment of time. Didn't really believe God. Didn't really believe that was important. Terrible thing. Rejected that whole birthright thing, which included the promises of God. In Hebrews 12:16, it says that Esau was profane. He was a godless person. And in Hebrews 12:16, it says, "Don't be like him." Um, Unholy, like Esau. Um, we're not supposed to follow that example. We're supposed to believe God and count what God communicates as important, the most important thing for our lives. And that was Esau. Profane, godless, refused. This is the kind of thing that comes with unbelief, is people refuse to admit they're sinners. And that refuse to understand that they're unacceptable to God. And Esau, like we do sometimes, he went his own way, lived only for the things of this world. His own desires were more important to him than what God wanted to give him and teach him. He did not value God's promises, and that's what he could have had. And he knew it, because he wasn't just a little kid here. He was a hunter. He knew it, and he sold it in a moment of time. And Jacob, he was more like Abraham and Isaac. He saw that as such a valuable thing, and he was willing to trade some stew for it. If that's what it took, he wanted that. He wanted God's promises. And although he was the second son, he believed God, and he wanted that inheritance from his father. He wanted what Abraham had and what Isaac had. He believed God. He trusted him. And we're going to see Jacob's not a perfect person, but he valued communication from God. He valued the things that God valued. And we're going to see Jacob was aware of his own sinfulness. He came to God the way God required. And he realized that God's promises were important. His promise deliverer, he valued them. And we need to consider that too. What are we like? Are we like Esau, turned away from what God communicated? Or are we going to be like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and come before God the way God requires, and believe him, and admit that we're in sin, and trust him? Well, God had chosen Jacob to be given the rights, the firstborn, instead of Esau. And we see that God gave that promise to their mother, but even before they were born. God had chosen Jacob, and God knew what Esau's heart was going to be like, and he knew what Jacob's heart would be like. And Jacob trusted God, and God, even beforehand, chose Jacob, and he was to receive the inheritance, and he did receive the inheritance. And when the time came for the blessings to be passed down to their sons, um, Jacob received that from his father. Esau was very angry because he lost the privileges that came with being the firstborn. Um, and they meant little to him, but he still wanted the inheritance. He was focused on the things he could get. So Esau was mad because Jacob received his blessing. Jacob received his inheritance. And Esau was so mad that he planned to kill Jacob as soon as their father had died. In Genesis 27:41, it says, "Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother." After his father died, he was going to kill his brother. Those were his plans. He was a unbeliever, a murderer in his heart. And then farther along in 27, 42 to 44, it says, "But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, Behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban, my brother in Haran, and stay with him a while, until your brother's fury turns away." So they're living in Canaan, and Esau is mad at Jacob, and Jacob's mother tells him, go to where my family is. Go to Haran. And that was the place that the family was familiar with. They passed through there before, and Jacob's mother was from there. She had relatives. Go to my uncle. Go to your uncle. Or excuse me, it was Rebekah's uncle, their family. And so Jacob flees to Haran. And Genesis 28:10, it says, Jacob left Beersheba and he went toward Haran. And while they were on the way, God spoke to Jacob in a dream. And it was far enough to where he had to sleep on the way. And Genesis 28:11, it says, "And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep." That's pretty crude camping, but that's what he did. Out underneath the stars, and he's laying down to sleep. And God gave him a dream. And in Genesis 28:12, it says, "And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it." Remember, imagine that dream. A ladder, maybe a stairway, touching earth and going up to heaven, to the presence of God. And the angels were coming back and forth on it. I wonder if that's just a thing that's always really there. Angels are able to come back and forth to earth freely, and that access is there. We're just hindered from seeing it. I don't know, but that's what he saw. That's what he saw. And it was symbolic of the way is opened between earth and heaven. God is going to provide a way for this to be reality, that we can symbolically be on that ladder and be in the presence of God. Because that unity between God and men, that's the origin of creation. Adam and Eve, in the beginning, they had that unity with their Creator, a friendship relationship, and spoke freely to each other. And we see that in the little tiny bit of experience that we have with Adam and Eve in the garden. Disobedience caused separation, and separation really is death. Three aspects of death we talked about, but separation. And the consequences for our sin is that separation. The consequences for our sin is death. In our relationship, our spirit from our body, and then eternal separation from God eventually in the future, if God doesn't provide something. And so Jacob saw this. He saw this thing that represented reconciliation between heaven and earth, between God and man. He saw these angels going back and forth, an open door into the presence of God in heaven. That's what God was showing Jacob. This can happen. There's a way. I'm going to take care of it. And God right from the beginning, we see in Genesis that God planned to send this deliverer who would destroy the influence of sin in mankind, which was through Satan, through the devil. And we have a little illustration of what we're just talking about. That way is open. And that was his dream. God gave that to him when he was sleeping on his way to Haran. And God had gave Jacob the same promises he had given to Abraham and Isaac. So it wasn't just passed down from a father to his son. Here in this passage, we're going to see that God, again, with Jacob, reconfirmed these promises in Genesis chapter 28, 13 to 15. It says, "And behold, the Lord stood above it." Oh, we're talking about this ladder, these stairs, or whatever exactly it was, a ladder, the Bible says. "And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your offspring." And so it's God himself communicating from heaven, God himself communicating to man that way at that moment, and that dream was open. Yeah, and it says in 28:14 says, "Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and the south, and in you, your off, and in you and your offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Behold, I am with you. I will keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised." The same promises that God gave to Abraham and God gave to Isaac, he's now giving to Jacob. And Jacob, the one who inherited from his father, he got these promises about this coming blessing, that all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. And in our study, we're calling that the deliverer. Deliverer from the influence of Satan, the deliverer from sin. This descendant would be the go-between and make it possible for the relationship, the friendship to be restored between God and man. Jacob awoke from his dream, and he knew that God had given him those same promises. Then Jacob, in 29:1, Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. In other words, Rebekah's family, her uncle. Jacob arrived where he was going. And farther along at 31:13, it says, "And I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now rise, go out from this land, return to the land of your kindred." So between 29 and 31, Jacob is there for various years, and then God calls him out. He calls him out of Haran to go back home, and he returns. And God is going to give him that land that he promised. God protected him. He prospered him while he was in Haran. And it was going to be through his family that God's promises would be fulfilled, this coming deliverer. So he went back to Canaan, and God gave him a new name on his way back to Canaan. And in 32:28 it says, then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." This name Israel means one who strives with God. That's what happened with Jacob when he was in his dream. He strove with God, and he wanted God's blessing. He wanted God's promises, and God gave them to him. And God changed his name. That's where this name Israel, the nation of Israel, that's where that name comes from. So this Jacob now in history is no longer going to be called Jacob, but Israel. He's often referred to as Jacob, but God gave him a new name according to the promises he had given him. And so we come in our study to Jacob is Israel. Jacob, this Israel, is the father of more sons who are going to be the beginning of the nation that we see today. And Jacob had various sons. We're going to get into that a little bit later in a future study. And then just finishing up here, Genesis 37:1 It says Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojourning, in the land of Canaan. He lived many years there. There had many children, and he lived in that place where God had promised him. And we're going to finish up this part of our study now, and we're reminded of God's faithfulness, that God always does what he says he will, and whatever promises we find for us, God will bring them to fruition. He will make good on his promises for us. We have a future in him. But at this moment in history, God is working his plans to bring the deliverer, to bring this blessing to all the families of the earth. And he did this through Jacob, who is now called Israel. We're going to finish our study now, Firm Foundations, and we'll continue on in our next lesson.